The sensor alarm didn't scream. It beeped once, politely, the way a well-designed system announces a minor routing error or a calibration fault in a secondary array. 412 years of commanding conclave vessels had taught Admiral Vale Soreth to know the difference between an alarm that wanted his attention and one that wanted his concern. This one, he decided in the first half-second, wanted neither. He was wrong. Admiral, his science officer, Preth, had a voice like cooling stone, flat, unhurried, the kind of voice that had delivered bad news so many times, it had simply stopped wrapping it in anything. "I need you at my station." Vale crossed the command deck of Fortress Orin without rushing. Rushing was for junior officers and species that hadn't lived long enough to know that panic was contagious and commanders who caught it were dangerous. He stood behind Preth's shoulder and looked at the display. The sensor was reading an object at the edge of the system. It had classified the object 3 times in 4 seconds and changed its answer each time. First it said, debris cluster. Then it said, dead moon, low albedo, irregular orbit. Then the classification field simply went blank, and a small amber symbol appeared that Vale had not seen in 2 centuries of fleet service. A symbol that meant the system had given up and was asking a living being to take over. Distance? Vale said. 14 light minutes and closing. Speed? Preth paused. That pause was the first thing that made something cold move through Vale's chest. Preth did not pause. "It is decelerating," he said. "It was moving at 0.31 light speed when we first detected it. It has already shed 40% of that velocity. It saw us. It saw us at 14 light minutes, before our own long-range array flagged it." Vale looked at the shape on the display. The sensors were still struggling with it. The outline kept shifting, not because the object was changing shape, but because the sensor suite could not find a reference in its database that matched what it was looking at. It was large, roughly 900 meters stem to stern by the best estimate, though the irregular profile made measurement difficult. It was asymmetrical in a way that suggested function over design, as if whoever built it had made additions and alterations over many years, and had not worried about what the result looked like when you stood back from it. Sections of the hull showed different spectral signatures, which meant different materials, which meant different ages. Parts of this thing were old, and parts of it were newer, and none of it matched. "What is it?" Vale asked. "Unknown." "Whose configuration?" "Unknown." Vale looked at his science officer. Prith was 4 centuries old. He had surveyed 41 star systems. He had catalogued 6 previously unknown species, and filed the first contact reports on 3 of them. He did not say unknown. "There are life signs," Preth said, and pulled up the biological reading on a secondary screen. "Bilateral symmetry, 2 primary limbs, 2 secondary limbs. Oxygen breathing. Carbon-based, standard carbon chain chemistry. Warm-blooded, which was uncommon but not rare. Brain structure suggesting high cognitive function. Average individual lifespan reading." Preth's instruments calibrated this from cellular decay markers and bone density of approximately 80 standard years. Vale stared at that number. 80 years. Some civilizations in the conclave measured their institutional memory in thousands of years. The Chiveri Combine had records going back 7 millennia. The Cathari, Vale's own people, had been spacefaring for 900 years. 80 years was not a lifespan. It was barely enough time to learn what the universe contained before it was over. "Mammals," Preth said. He said it the way you say a word you're not sure is the right one. "Bilateral, warm-blooded, short-lived. Oxygen world, most likely. Single star system origin, based on the cellular markers. How many aboard? The hull is too dense for an accurate count. Best estimate, several hundred." Vale turned to his communications officer. "Open a standard hailing frequency. All 47 conclave languages, rotating, with the greeting protocol." The greeting protocol was a 700-word message that had been refined over 2 centuries of first contact situations. It established non-hostile intent. It offered resource exchange. It invited response in any form. It had ended 11 potential conflicts before they began and opened formal relations with 23 species. The conclave was proud of it. The ship did not respond. Not immediately, and not after 3 minutes of transmission, and not after Vale's communications officer tried 5 different signal formats on 5 different frequencies. The ship continued decelerating. It was now 12 light minutes out. It was slowing in a controlled, precise way that suggested it knew exactly where it was going, and was in no hurry to get there. "It's not ignoring us," Preth said quietly. "It received our signal. I can see the hull respond to the transmission frequency. There are receivers. Someone on that ship heard us. They chose not to answer." Vale looked at Fortress Oran's tactical display. 7 kilometers of layered armor plating. 47 species had contributed materials, design specifications, and engineering expertise over 300 years. The main weapons array could reduce a small moon to gravel in 40 minutes. The interceptor bays held 412 fighters, each crewed by pilots who trained for a decade before they were allowed near a live system. Fortress Oran had never been breached. It had never been seriously threatened. It existed partly as a military installation, and partly as a reminder to the galaxy that the Conclave was a permanent thing, and permanence had a shape, and that shape was 7 kilometers of layered armor, orbiting a dying star. One ship, 900 meters. No response to hailing. Vale watched it come. He told himself the cold thing in his chest was the recycled air of the command deck. 10 light minutes. 8. The ship was clearly visible on the optical array now, and the image confirmed what the sensors had struggled to say. It was ugly. Every ship Vale had ever commanded had been built with some attention to its appearance. The Cathari believed that a vessel's form reflected the dignity of the civilization that launched it. The Shivari built their warships with sweeping curves and bioluminescent hull markings. Even the most pragmatic of the Conclave member species produced vessels that had a coherent aesthetic, a visual logic, a shape that said something about who had made it. This ship looked like it had been built by someone who was angry and in a hurry and did not have enough of the right materials and made do with what was available, and then did it again 3 more times, on top of the original structure. The hull was scarred in patterns that suggested previous damage and repair, some of the repairs clearly done under conditions that did not allow for precision work. There were protrusions and additions that served obvious functions, weapon mounts, sensor arrays, docking mechanisms, but they were placed wherever they fit, rather than wherever they looked correct. The whole thing had the appearance of something that had survived a great many situations it was not originally designed for. Vale found, to his great discomfort, that he could not look away from it. 6 light minutes. The ship was no longer decelerating. It had matched the orbital velocity of Fortress Oran's outer patrol zone, and simply stopped. It sat there, at 6 light minutes, and it looked at the fortress, the way you look at a problem you are about to solve. "Admiral," Preth's voice, very flat, very even. "They have opened a channel." Vale straightened. Here it was. The demand, or the ultimatum, or whatever opening gambit a 900-meter vessel crewed by short-lived mammals thought it could deploy against the most fortified structure in this sector of the galaxy. He nodded to his communications officer. The channel opened. The voice was female. It had a particular quality that Vale could not immediately name. Not aggressive, not nervous, not formal. It was the voice of someone who had already made a decision, and was now simply informing others of it. "Fortress Oran," the voice said, "you are holding 17 human citizens as political leverage. This is your one conversation." Vale opened his mouth. The ship turned its broadside to the fortress. Not an attack posture. Not exactly. It was the posture of a ship that wanted you to see what it had on its side, the way a person might turn to show you something they were carrying, before they decided whether to put it down or use it. Vale looked at the weapons array that had just rotated into view. He looked at the targeting signatures that had appeared on his tactical board, precise, locked, not on the fortress itself, but on his flagship, the command vessel in Oran's outer dock. They had identified the command structure before they had finished their approach. The cold thing in his chest became something else. He had been in this job for 412 years. He had faced enemies that could shatter moons. He had negotiated with hive minds that thought in centuries, and machine intelligences that calculated the future in probability trees, 30 years deep. He had never, in 412 years, felt what he felt in this moment. It was not fear exactly. It was the particular sensation of a very experienced person realizing, very suddenly, that they have misunderstood something important. He looked at the targeting locks on his board. They had identified the command ship, before they answered the hail. before they finished decelerating. The entire approach, the deceleration, the silence, the positioning, had been a scan. They had spent 14 light minutes reading Fortress Orin the way you read a map, and they had already planned their route through it, and they had opened a channel only after they knew exactly where to point. Vale looked at the ship on his screen. He thought about 40 years ago. A trade convoy report. Rumors from the Outer Rim. A species someone had mentioned briefly in a conclave session, and the chamber had moved on because there were more pressing matters, and the species was new and small and lived for 80 years, and what could they possibly do that required the conclave's serious attention? He thought, we didn't ignore them because they were harmless. We ignored them because we were not paying attention. Those are very different things. Get me the conclave diplomatic channel, he said. His voice was steady. He was proud of that. And someone find out who those 17 humans are, and why they are in our detention wing. He already knew the answer was not going to be good enough. Nothing he could say in the next 60 seconds was going to be good enough. The ship sat at 6 light minutes and waited, and the waiting was somehow the most frightening part of all. The protein brick tasted like compressed cardboard, with a faint suggestion of something that had once, at a great distance, been related to cheese. Gunnery Sergeant Raina Marsh had been eating them for 11 years, and she had never once enjoyed one, and she had also never once stopped eating them, because they were calorie-dense, and her shift started in 4 minutes, and sitting down to a full meal before combat operations was the kind of thing you stopped doing after the first time you had to clean up afterward. She was on her 3rd bite when Lieutenant Commander Hargreaves appeared at the hatchway to the gunnery deck. "We're at combat range," he said. Raina swallowed, stood up, tucked the remaining half of the protein brick into her left vest pocket for later, pulled up her station screens with the ease of someone who had done it 10,000 times, which she had, and looked at the tactical situation in front of her. Fortress Orin filled the main display. 7 kilometers of layered armor. She had looked at the specifications in the mission brief and found them, frankly, impressive, in the way that very large immovable things were impressive. Cathedrals, mountains, bureaucracies. The kind of impressive that made you feel small, right up until the moment you started thinking about what it would take to deal with it, at which point it became an engineering problem. Raina was very good at engineering problems. The ship around her was the Vehemence, and it was home in the way that only a vessel you have spent years aboard can be home. Not comfortable, exactly. Not designed for comfort, but known in the bone-deep way that means you can walk its corridors in the dark and know every turn before you reach it. She knew which deck plates rang when you stepped on them, and which coffee dispenser on level 3 dispensed something better described as hot brown water, and which bunk on the port side had a loose frame bolt that knocked against the wall at irregular intervals and drove anyone sleeping nearby toward the edge of madness. She knew all of this the way you know the details of a place you have lived in long enough to stop seeing them. The Vehemence was not a beautiful ship. She had been told this by people who saw it from the outside, and she had never argued with them. What the Vehemence was effective. It was effective the way a tool that has been used correctly for a very long time becomes effective. Worn smooth in the right places, reinforced where it needed reinforcing, stripped down to what worked and kept there. Captain Oduya had addressed the crew before they dropped out of faster-than-light travel. The address had lasted 40 seconds. Raina had heard longer announcements about changing the schedule for the midweek mess cleaning. Oduya had stood at the front of the assembly bay with her hands behind her back and said the following words in the following order. "There are 17 people in that fortress who are there because they are human, and the conclave thought that made them useful. We are going to explain why it does not. Do the job. Come home. That's it." Then she had walked out, and the crew had dispersed to their stations, and Raina had felt something tighten in her throat that she attributed to the recycled air, and moved on. She settled into her gunnery chair and ran her eyes across her team. 6 people, all of them watching her. There was Corporal Adeze Obi on primary targeting, 24 years old, from a city on the coast that Raina had never visited, with the particular focused stillness of someone who had found the thing they were built for. There was Senior Specialist Owen Hale on the secondary array, who had a small succulent in a cracked ceramic pot sitting at the edge of his console and had named it Gerald, and would not be moved on this, despite 2 conversations with his section chief about appropriate workstation conditions. There was Technical Specialist Nadia Drummond, who tracked ammunition loads and power routing, and could tell you at any given moment exactly how many shots the ship had left before it needed to make some choices. There was fire control analyst Ben Carver, who was the youngest person on the team at 22, and who compensated for this by being the most meticulous. There was Petty Officer First Class Lou Adkins, who had been on the Vehemence for 8 years and had served with Reyna for 6 of them, and who communicated in a dialect of minimal words and raised eyebrows that Reyna had learned to read like a second language. "Checklist," Reyna said. This was how it always started. Not with a speech, not with a moment of reflection on the weight of what they were about to do. The checklist existed because it worked, and it worked because it was thorough, and it was thorough because someone had sat down after something went wrong and written down every step that needed to happen, so nothing would go wrong in that particular way again. The checklist was a record of every mistake the gunnery branch had ever made, converted into a process for not making those mistakes anymore. Reyna found this deeply sensible. She went through it name by name. Each person answered with their station status. The rhythm of it was familiar, and the familiarity was the point. When you had said the same words in the same order enough times, the words themselves became a kind of anchor, a way of establishing that the room was the room you knew, and the people in it were the people you trusted, and the situation, however strange it looked from the outside, was one you had prepared for. The fortress had received their channel. It had not responded to Captain Oduya's statement in any way that suggested it intended to comply. Reyna had been doing this long enough to know what that meant. It meant the other side was calculating, running numbers, deciding how serious the threat was. She had also been doing this long enough to know that the other side running those numbers was not a bad thing. It meant they were thinking. Thinking took time. Time was what you used to get into position. "Carver," she said. "Communication array. Bearing and distance." Carver read out the numbers without looking up from his screen. He had already identified it. Of course he had. Reyna pulled up the targeting solution and looked at it for 3 seconds. The communication array was not the weapons system, not the shield generators, not the command structure. It was the thing that let Fortress Orin call for help. Taking it out first was not cruelty. It was a way of keeping the conversation between exactly the people who needed to be having it, without the situation getting complicated by the arrival of additional parties who had not been part of the original problem. Captain Oduya's voice came over the ship-wide channel. The conclave had sent a counter-message, a diplomatic representative, formal, with the practiced cadence of someone who had delivered ultimatums for a living and considered it a reasonable career. Oduya listened for approximately 12 seconds and then cut the channel. Reyna appreciated this about Oduya. She did not make speeches. She did not make threats. She had said what needed to be said once, and the next communication would be the kind that did not use words. The conclave's diplomatic channel lit up again immediately. They were persistent. The voice was different this time, higher level, more authority, listing consequences. Reyna heard her own name in the middle of a list of crew members. The diplomat had done research. The diplomat was trying to make this personal, to make each person on this ship feel that the weight of the outcome rested on them individually, which was the kind of technique that worked on people who had not already decided what they were doing and why. Reyna pulled her headset off. She looked at Gerald the succulent. Gerald was a small, slightly lopsided plant, with 3 thick leaves and a look of complete indifference to the situation. Owen Hale had brought it aboard 8 months ago and had maintained it with a dedication that Reyna found, privately, somewhat admirable. It had survived a firefight in the outer belt in which the gunnery deck had lost pressure for 4 minutes. It had survived a power fluctuation that fried 2 targeting computers. It had survived whatever the ship dispensed as water. It was, in its quiet way, very hard to stop. Reyna put her headset back on. "Checklist complete," she said. It was not a question. 6 voices answered. 6 confirmations. 6 people who had already made their decisions, and were now simply waiting to execute them. The Vehemence was not the largest ship in the human fleet. It was not the newest. It was not, if you were being precise about it, particularly impressive in the way that the fleet's more modern vessels were impressive. What it was the ship the Navy sent when it needed a conversation to go a specific way in a short amount of time. This was not written anywhere in the ship's official designation. It did not need to be written. The people who worked on the Vehemence knew what they were part of, and the people who worked against the vehemence, eventually, learned. 4 other human ships were sitting dark in this system, outside the range of Fortress Oran's sensors. They were not here to fight. They were here to watch, and to go home, and to report what they saw if the vehemence did not come back. This was also not written anywhere in the official mission parameters. It also did not need to be. Reyna thought about the 17 people in that detention wing. She did not know their names yet. She would look up the names in the mission brief later, after the extraction, when it was over and there was time. Right now, they were a number and a location on a schematic, and that was enough. The number was 17, and the location was accessible, and the rest was process. "Gunnery team," she said. She did not raise her voice. She never raised her voice. "First shot is the comms array. Secondary target package on my mark. We do this clean and we go home." Lou Adkins, across the deck, raised one eyebrow 2 millimeters. Reyna read it as, "Understood, and in agreement, and not worried, but would appreciate confirmation that the timeline was what it appeared to be." She gave a small nod. Adkins looked back at his board. Captain Oduya's voice came over the ship-wide address, quiet and without decoration, the same voice she used for everything, from emergency alerts to reminders about the mess schedule. "Marsh, light them up." Reyna exhaled once through her nose. Press the firing key. The vehemence spoke. The first shot did not hit Fortress Oran. Admiral Vale Soreth was watching the tactical display when it happened. A single, precise energy discharge from the vehemence, traveling at the speed of light, arriving at Fortress Oran's outer communication array in 6 light minutes of travel time. The array was not a weapon. It was not a shield. It was not a structural component. It was the piece of equipment that let Fortress Oran talk to the rest of the galaxy. It was gone before Vale fully processed that the shot had been fired. "Long-range communications are down," his systems officer said. Then, after a pause that contained a great deal of unspoken recalibration, they took out the comms. "Not the weapons," Preth said. He was already running the analysis. Vale could tell by the way his hands moved across his station. "Not the shield generators. Not the interceptor bay controls. Not the command deck. The comms. They don't want us calling for help," Vale said. It came out quiet, quieter than he intended. He was looking at the display where the communication array used to be, and he was doing a calculation he had not been asked to do, but could not stop his mind from running. The vehemence had, at the moment of firing, approximately 40 viable targets on Fortress Oran. 40 systems, structures, and components that a military asset would logically consider attacking first. The weapon systems were the obvious choice, the standard doctrine choice, the choice that any of the 47 conclave species would have made in this situation, because removing the enemy's ability to fire back is the first principle of every military tradition Vale had ever studied. They had taken out the comms. They did not want Oran to call for help. They did not want this to become a larger situation. They wanted this to be a contained situation, with a specific outcome, and they had, in the first shot, shaped the parameters of that outcome with a precision that made Vale feel something he had not felt in 4 centuries. Prith was already saying it before Vale fully formed the thought. "They have a plan," Prith said. He was reading the targeting data, running their own analysis of the shot's trajectory and power calibration. This was not a warning shot. This was a first step. They already know what the second and third steps are. Fortress Oran's defense systems activated. This was automatic. The fortress had its own response protocols, layers of automated countermeasures that engaged the moment an incoming shot was detected. The interceptor wing alert sounded across the deck. 412 fighter pilots were already moving. Vale watched the tactical board as Oran's defense doctrine activated in sequence, the way it had been designed to activate, the way it had been wargamed and tested and refined over 200 years of careful iteration. It was, by every measure he knew how to apply, a perfect defensive system. The vehemence watched it activate. That was the detail that stayed with Vale afterward, more than anything else. The ship did not respond immediately to the defense system spinning up. It observed, for approximately 90 seconds, as Fortress Oran deployed its automated defenses and its interceptor wing began to form up. The vehemence simply gathered information. Then it moved. Not toward the fortress. Not away from it. It moved laterally, in a direction that initially made no tactical sense, and then made complete sense when Vale saw what it was doing. It was positioning itself between two of Fortress Orin's defensive grid nodes, in a gap that existed not because the grid designers had overlooked it, but because the gap was too small for any vessel larger than a scout to fit through without risking collision with the node's sensor fields. The vehemence was 900 meters long. The gap was 940 meters wide. "They mapped our defense grid," Vale said. Not loudly, not with outrage, with the level voice of a person updating his understanding of a situation. "Before they arrived," Preth said, "this approach angle was planned before they dropped out of FTL. They knew the grid spacing." "From where?" Preth did not answer, which was an answer. Vale thought about conclave diplomatic missions, trade envoys, the long-range sensor surveys that various member species filed as part of their standard astronomical programs, the mapping data that was pooled, cataloged, shared across 47 civilizations, because shared information was the foundation of a functioning alliance. All of it stored in systems that were, nominally, secure. He thought about how many different ways a sufficiently motivated species with 80 years per individual and 3 centuries of spaceflight development might have found to look at data that was, technically, not meant for them. The interceptor wing deployed, 412 fighters, forming up in the configuration that had broken armadas, that had been the last thing a dozen hostile forces had ever seen. It was a beautiful formation, in the way that very precise and very dangerous things were beautiful. The vehemence fired 4 shots. 4 seconds. 1 shot per second. The 4 shots went to 4 specific points in the formation, and the 4 points were the 4 wing commanders, the ships carrying the officers whose orders the rest of the formation depended on. Not destroyed, disabled. The shots were calibrated to knock out drive systems and communications, not to destroy. And Vale, watching the formation begin to dissolve into confusion, felt a sharp and specific admiration that he immediately recognized as inappropriate and could not quite make himself stop feeling. Without the wing commanders, the formation lost its coherence. Individual pilots were well trained. Individual pilots were skilled. Individual pilots did not, without coordination, constitute a formation that had been designed to function as a unified system. The shape that had broken armadas became 412 individual ships, trying to figure out what to do next. The vehemence moved through the gap the confusion created. Vale's tactical officer was issuing secondary deployment orders, trying to reorganize, trying to compensate. Vale let him work. He watched the display. He was trying to understand the pattern, not just the individual moves, but the logic underneath them. There was a logic. He was certain of it. Every move the vehemence made was, after the fact, obvious. The shot selection, the approach angle, the specific choice of the wing commanders, rather than the fighters themselves. It was obvious in the way that a very elegant solution to a problem was obvious once you saw it, and completely invisible until you did. They were not trying to destroy Fortress Orin. He understood this now with a certainty that settled into his chest alongside the other things that had settled there in the past hour. Every shot, every maneuver, every system they had chosen to target, had been selected for what it accomplished, rather than for the damage it caused. The communication array was down but repairable. The interceptor wing was disorganized but intact. The defense grid nodes were untouched because the vehemence had gone around them rather than through them. The fortress was still entirely functional. It was simply, at this moment, in a situation it had not been designed to handle. A situation being created not by a fleet, not by a siege, not by the kind of sustained military campaign that the fortress's designers had planned for, but by one ship making a series of very specific, very carefully chosen moves toward a specific, very limited objective. Prith had patched the vehemence's internal communications to Vale's station. It was partial, fragmented, some of it encrypted and some of it not. What came through was not tactical chatter. There were no dramatic exchanges about the weight of the mission, no urgent voices calling out damage reports, no sense of a crew under extreme pressure making desperate decisions. What came through sounded like people doing a job they had done before. Someone read coordinates, and someone else confirmed them. Someone made a brief comment, and someone else responded with something that was not a tactical update. It was, Vale thought, the sound of competence so thorough it had become routine. The most frightening thing he had ever heard. He had spent 4 centuries around military forces. He knew what people sounded like under pressure. He knew the difference between a force that was holding together through discipline and a force that was not feeling the pressure in the first place because it had accounted for the pressure before it arrived. The first kind was admirable. The second kind was something else. Vale keyed his own channel. He made a decision that was not in any protocol he had ever been trained in, bypassed his communications officer, and opened a direct line to the Vehemence's gunnery frequency. A voice answered. Female. There was a sound like someone chewing something. Yeah? Vale said. Why are you not firing on the fortress itself? You have the firing angle. You could end this. A pause. Not a long pause. The kind of pause someone takes when they are deciding whether to answer a question that does not deserve an answer. We are not here to end it, she said. We are here to get our people. The fortress is fine. You are the one who has to live in this sector after we leave. The channel closed. Vale stared at the display. She had said after we leave, not if we leave. After. With the certainty of a person stating a fact about a sequence of events that had already been decided. On the tactical board, the Vehemence had reached the outer hull of Fortress Oran's detention wing. Vale watched the targeting solutions disappear one by one from his board as the ship's weapons pivoted away from offensive positions. A docking clamp extended from the Vehemence's port side. Not a weapon. Not a breach charge. A docking clamp, the kind used to connect with a station for supply transfer or crew exchange. They were going to knock on the door. From the inside. Reyna watched the schematic on her secondary screen, while her hands stayed on the gunnery board. The boarding team's locator signals moved through Fortress Oran's detention wing in a pattern she had helped design 3 weeks ago, in a room on the Vehemence where someone had taped a rough diagram of the fortress's interior to a wall, and they had all stood around it with coffee and argued about routes. The route they had settled on was the second route. The first route was faster. The second route went through fewer guard stations. That was the math, and it was not complicated math. Lieutenant Osei's signal was at the front of the 12-person team, as it always was. He had a way of moving through spaces that Reyna had noticed over 2 years of working alongside him. Purposeful without being aggressive. Decisive without being loud. The way someone moves when they are entirely sure of where they are going, and are saving their energy for the parts that will actually require it. She watched his signal, and the 11 signals behind him, and she did her job, which right now was watching the sensor overlay and talking them through it. 2 personnel. Stationary. North Corridor Junction, she said. Her voice was the same as it always was during an operation, even, paced, the voice of someone describing geography. They have not moved in 4 minutes. Take the east branch, door on your left, through the storage section. Osei's acknowledgement was a single click. The signals moved east. She had not been on the boarding team. This was the correct decision for several reasons, and she understood all of them, and had agreed with the assignment without argument. What she was the eyes that the boarding team did not have, the real-time sensor picture, the movement of guards, the structural information she could pull from the fortress's own systems, which the Vehemence's technical teams had been working on accessing since before they dropped out of FTL, and which had cooperated more fully than expected, possibly because Fortress Oran had not been designed by people who imagined that anyone would get close enough to plug into its systems directly. The detention wing held the 17 humans in 3 adjacent sections. This she knew from the life sign data. She had looked at the life sign data many times in the past 3 weeks, and she had not let herself think too specifically about the people the life signs represented, because that kind of thinking was not useful during preparation, and was not useful during execution. After it was done, she could think about it. Osei's team reached the first section. 8 of the 17 were there. The team leader's voice came over the comms, quiet and clear. Section 1. 8 individuals. Mobile. Beginning extraction. Mobile. Reyna let that word sit for half a second. Mobile meant they could move under their own power. Mobile was the best word she had heard today. 2 guards, rotating toward your position from the main corridor, she said. 40 seconds. The team moved. The guards rotated. The timing worked because she had given them the timing, and the timing was accurate, because she had been watching that guard rotation for 11 minutes, and counting the interval. The Vehemence's hull groaned very softly, the sound of the docking clamp under load, the physical reality of a 900-meter ship attached to a 7-kilometer fortress by a mechanical connection designed for something much less dramatic. Owen Hale, at his station, glanced at the structural stress reading and then back at his console without comment, within normal parameters. Gerald the Succulent did not move, which was its position on most subjects. Second section, 6 more, all mobile. Third section, 3. The 17th life sign was in a room slightly separated from the others, which was either a medical situation or a disciplinary one, and Reyna was in the process of opening her mouth to flag this to Osei when his signal had already changed course toward it, because he had seen it too, because he was good at what he did. Found the last one, he said. Status? A pause. 3 seconds. Mobile, he said. She exhaled through her nose. Your route back is clear. The guard shift change in the main corridor happens in 9 minutes. You want to be through the junction before that. Understood. The 17 life signs plus 12 team life signs moved through the schematic. Reyna tracked them with the focused attention of someone doing a task that requires complete and continuous concentration, and allows no part of the mind to wander anywhere else. This was, she understood, the function of this kind of concentration, not just operational necessity, but the way that having something specific to do prevents you from thinking about what it means that you need to do it at all. She thought about it anyway. She was good at compartmentalization, but she was not perfect, and what broke through the compartment was not the large abstract thing, but the small specific one, the teenager. The mission brief had said one of the 17 was 19 years old, had been an intern on a research station, had been in that detention wing for 4 months. 4 months was 122 days, 122 days in a section of a fortress that no one had been supposed to come and get them out of, because the people who put them there did not believe anyone was coming. Reyna had been 19 once. She had done an internship once. It was in a military administration office, and it had been boring, and she had spent most of it filing transfer records and eating bad cafeteria food. She had gone home afterward. The boarding team reached the docking clamp access. 17 signals, 12 team signals, all moving, all coherent. Osei's voice. All personnel aboard the access corridor. Sealing the breach. Confirm 17. Reyna said. Confirmed. 17. She looked at her board. She looked at Gerald. She closed her eyes. 1 second. Maybe 2. Captain, she said. Package delivered. Ready to disengage. Oduya's voice came back immediately. 3 words. Flat and even. The voice of someone confirming a calculation that had come out correctly. Good work, Marsh. Reyna sat with those 3 words for a moment. She let them be exactly what they were, which was enough. Then she started pulling her gunnery team back to transit posture, because the next thing was going home, and home was a known route, and getting there was a process, and process was what you had when the thing you did was too large to hold all at once. The vehemence left the way it had come. Vale stood at his console and watched it go, and the watching had a quality he had not experienced in a very long time, the quality of witnessing something that would require him to change the shape of a very large number of assumptions. The docking clamp retracted. The ship's profile shifted from station attached to transit configuration. Its velocity began building. No announcement, no declaration, no final transmission of any kind. It simply left, moving back toward the gap in the defense grid it had come through, accelerating with the efficient, unhurried momentum of a vessel going somewhere it had already planned to go. Vale watched until the signal was a point, then a diminishing point. Then a marker on a long-range screen, then nothing. Prith appeared at his shoulder. He had a data display in his hand, the tactical post-mortem, or the beginning of one. The complete analysis would take days. This was the first 4 hours of it, enough to begin understanding what had happened. Vale took the display. He read it standing up because sitting down felt wrong. The vehemence had taken 1 confirmed hit, a partial charge strike from one of the automated defense systems, damaging a secondary weapons array. The damage was minor. Prith's analysis included a notation that the strike's angle suggested it had hit a section of hull already reinforced from previous engagements, which was consistent with the visual evidence of the ship's repair history, and which implied that the vehemence had positioned itself so that the hits it expected were going to land on the parts of itself best equipped to receive them. The conclave had thrown 412 fighters at it. Not one of those fighters had been destroyed. The fortress, 7 kilometers of 3th-century collaborative engineering, was entirely intact. Structurally, functionally, operationally intact. The communication array was down, but the repair estimate was 6 weeks. The interceptor wing was reforming. The defense grid was undamaged. The detention wing had a hull breach that was being sealed. By every physical measure, Fortress Orin had not been defeated. By every other measure, something had happened here that was going to take a long time to accurately describe. Vale called the emergency conclave session himself. He had the authority, and he used it, and within 3 hours, 47 species were represented in the secure channel, and for 40 minutes they were, collectively and with great energy, furious at him. He let them be furious. He had 4 centuries of practice at waiting for rooms to finish their initial response, before the useful part of a conversation began. When the first wave of outrage had run its course, he asked his question. How long have the humans been capable of this? The room went quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when a question has been asked that the room had collectively been hoping no one would ask. The elder delegate from the Shivari Combine spoke after a long pause, 7,000 years of institutional memory, and she sounded, Vale thought, like someone who was revising an estimate that had been wrong for longer than she wanted to acknowledge. Our analysts, she said, believe the capability has been present for approximately 60 standard years. 60 years. Vale did not say anything for a moment. He was looking at the number and what it contained. 60 years of capability. 3 generations of humans at 80 years per generation, which meant that humans alive today had been born into a civilization that could already do what the vehemence had done. They had not achieved this and then immediately used it. They had had it for 60 years, and they had used it now, in response to a specific situation, in a specific and limited way. They have not claimed our territory, Vale said. They have not demanded resources, or concessions, or formal submission. They came for 17 individuals. They retrieved those individuals. They have left. No one answered him. We held those individuals because we assumed the humans would calculate the cost of a confrontation with Fortress Orin and decide the cost was too high. He paused. He wanted this next part to land correctly. They did calculate the cost. They decided the cost was 17 people, and the calculation they made was that was unacceptable, and then they acted on that calculation. That is the entirety of the strategic logic. The Shivari delegate said slowly, and what does that mean for us? Vale thought about the gunnery sergeant's voice, the complete absence of anger in it, the complete absence of performance, the voice of someone who had decided what they were doing and was doing it, and when asked why they were not doing more, had said, "You are the one who has to live in this sector after we leave." He thought about the docking clamp, not a weapon, a door. He thought about the mission profile Preth had reconstructed, the minimum footprint, the specific targeting, the refusal to do more damage than the objective required. Military doctrine in most of the galaxy's civilizations rewarded overwhelming force, the visible demonstration of maximum capability, the statement of power that left no doubt. The vehemence had made a different statement. It had said, "We know exactly what we are capable of, and we used exactly what we needed, and the rest of it is still there and you know it." It means, Vale said, that we have made an error that will be expensive to correct. We have treated a peer power as a peripheral concern for 3 generations. We have done this because their individual lives are short and their civilization is young, and we assumed these facts were determinative. He looked at the display where the vehemence's signal had been. They are not determinative. What a species does with the time it has is determinative. We did not pay attention to what they were doing. The conclave session went on for another 6 hours. There were proposals and counter-proposals, analyses and assessments, voices arguing for a show of conclave force, and voices arguing for immediate diplomatic outreach, and voices arguing for a period of observation and study before any action was taken. Vale contributed where he was asked for his opinion, and was otherwise quiet, which was noticed and remarked upon by several delegates, because Vale was not typically a quiet participant in conclave sessions. He was quiet because he was thinking about a thing he could not stop thinking about. After the session ended and the channels closed and Vale was alone on Fortress Orin's command deck, He pulled up the last recorded communication from the Vehemence. It was a routine status report, filed with their fleet command within 3 minutes of clearing the system. He had obtained it through means that were technically within his authority as an admiral, and practically in a gray area that he would sort out later. The report was brief. It was in the precise, compressed language of a military bureaucratic filing. It contained 17 words. He read them several times. He thought about what it meant that the gunnery sergeant had filed it, not the captain, not the executive officer, the person running the weapons team. He had no context for what that meant within human military culture, no way to know whether it was standard procedure or an exception, whether it reflected a hierarchy different from any he understood, or simply a practical division of responsibilities. He could not know. He knew only that someone named Marsh had, within 3 minutes of completing an operation that had walked a single ship through Fortress Oran's defenses and recovered 17 human beings and departed without a casualty, filed a status report in the format of someone completing a standard administrative task. Mission complete. 17 recovered. 0 casualties. Returning to station. Marsh out. He sat with those 17 words for a long time. They were, he understood, the most useful thing he had read in the past 24 hours. Not the tactical analysis, not the damage assessment, not the 47 species session with its hours of argument. These 17 words, in their flat and final way, described what had actually happened, and why. Mission complete. That was the frame. This had been a mission with a defined objective, and the objective had been achieved. 17 recovered. That was the objective. 17 people, specific people, the reason for everything else. 0 casualties. On either side, he realized. They had been careful about that too. Returning to station. Already looking at the next thing. Already past this. Marsh out. Vale opened a new file on his console. He had written thousands of reports over 4 centuries. He had written analyses and assessments and after-action summaries and diplomatic recommendations and strategic proposals that had shaped conclave policy in ways that were still visible if you knew where to look. He had never written a report quite like the one he was writing now, because he had never needed to describe quite this kind of situation before. He typed the heading. He typed the subject line. He typed the classification recommendation, which was the highest one available, and then he typed the priority designation, which was also the highest one available. He paused. He thought about what he needed to say and about whether there was a shorter way to say it, because the shorter way was usually the truer way, and the truer the way, the more likely the people reading it were to understand it, before they started finding reasons not to. He wrote 1 paragraph. He wrote a second. He wrote a third that was half the length of the first 2, and contained most of what mattered. He wrote the recommendations section, which was the most important section, which was the section that would determine what the conclave did next, and he wrote it carefully and plainly, and without the diplomatic softening that he usually applied to recommendations, because this situation did not benefit from softening. He stopped before the final line. He thought for a moment about what the most important thing was. Not the tactical assessment, Preth could write a better one, not the strategic implications. The Shivari delegates team would produce something comprehensive within a week. Not the recommendation for formal diplomatic contact, which was obvious, and which everyone would arrive at eventually. He typed, "Note, they came for 17 people. Remember that. It matters more than the ship." Then he held his hand over the submission key. Somewhere in the dark between stars, the Vehemence was running at transit speed, carrying 17 people who had been in a detention wing this morning and were not there anymore. The ship was ugly and scarred, and had been repaired so many times that its hull was a physical record of everything it had survived, and the people inside it were soft and short-lived, and had named a small plant, and eaten compressed protein bricks, and filed status reports in the flat language of routine, and they had walked into Fortress Oran, and walked out of it with what they came for, and they were going home. Vale pressed the key. The report went out to the 47 conclave species. It went to the analysts and the advisors and the diplomats and the military strategists and the elder delegates who had 7,000 years of history behind them and had still, somehow, not seen this coming. He hoped they would read the last line first. He suspected most of them would read it last, if at all, because most people in positions of authority had learned to read for confirmation of what they already believed, and the last line was not confirmation of anything they already believed. But some of them would read it, and some of them would understand it, and that would be enough to start the conversation that needed to happen. Not the conversation about weapons range and defensive doctrine and sensor grid vulnerabilities, but the one about what kind of species does what the vehemence did, and why, and what it means to share a galaxy with them. Vale sat back in his chair. The dying star outside the viewport burned the way it always burned, slow and orange and indifferent, doing what it had been doing for billions of years, utterly unconcerned with the small and urgent events of the civilizations gathered near it. He had always found this comforting. The universe's indifference was, in its way, a kind of honesty. Nothing that happened here mattered to the star. Everything that happened here mattered to the people it happened to. And that was the whole of the distinction, and the distinction was everything. He thought about a person named Marsh eating a protein brick at a station that smelled like recycled air. He thought about a plant named Gerald. He thought about 17 people standing up when someone came through the door. The command deck was quiet. The repair crews were working on the communication array. The interceptor wing was running reintegration drills. Fortress Orin was doing what it always did, which was exist, massive and permanent, and entirely intact, exactly as it had been before the vehemence arrived, -1 communication array, and 17 people who were, right now, on a ship going home. Vale sat in the quiet and thought about what came next, and what came next was not a war and not a surrender, and not a period of careful mutual study at arm's length. What came next was a conversation, a real one, between people who had been in the same galaxy for 3 generations without ever actually talking, and it needed to start before the humans decided the conclave was not worth the conversation, because that was, Vale understood now, a conclusion they were entirely capable of reaching, and entirely capable of acting on, without drama or announcement or any of the forms of communication that the conclave relied on, to understand the intentions of others. They had shown up. They had done what they came to do. They had left. Next time, Vale intended to be the one who showed up first.